I'm looking forward to our discussions and to the contributions from the floor today. It's our conference. Let's make the most of it. Thank you.
I'm going to give you a figure, 8,120. Think about that. These are official figures, and this was from January to June of 2022. The next set of figures from June to December aren't published as yet. That was the number of people that presented to the Northern Ireland Housing Executive as homeless. 8,120 households. Households can be anything. Families, it can be families, it can be single people, single individuals, whatever you want to call it. 8,120. So that raise is actually 300 more, and it doesn't sound a lot, than the previous 6 months. If we imagine that the next set of figures are even going to duplicate that, we're talking probably in that calendar year of over 16,000 people, or 16,000 households rather, will have presented as homeless. That figure has kind of been consistent, I'm going to say, over the past 3 or 4 years. So that's the figure that we're talking about. That's official figures. That's who presents. So if we look at then those people that known commonly as sofa surfing or couch surfing, the hidden homeless, these are people that don't come, or households that do not come to the Housing Executive and present as homeless. There's figures suggesting that that could be any times 3 to 4 times the amount of people that are sitting on the wait or actually registered as homeless. So you'd be talking in figures in excess of potentially 40,000 people, or 40,000 households. And this includes, obviously, young children. I think those figures are horrendous. They're shocking, and they're shocking for people like me that work in this particular sector. But we know what it is, and we know what has to be done. And I think it's very important that the party takes the issue of homelessness on board. It ties in, obviously, to the wider housing strategy itself by the Housing Executive. But just to give you an idea, of that 8,120, you have to go through a process of selection or assessment. And out of that, 4,802 households were identified as statutorily homeless. In other words, what they receive is a thing called full duty applicant status. The other remaining people either are in temporary accommodation, which is hostels, bed and breakfasts, they could be in single lets, and that's where those people are housed. The bed and breakfast stroke hotels are expensive and obviously bite into the public purse. The Housing Executive don't want to be there, providers don't want to be there that try to prevent homelessness, but that's the reality of it, and the money is not there, and that's biting into what should be there for maybe building programs and also support services. So just think about those figures. Some of the reasons for people losing their tenancy, what do you call it, would be, and the biggest one, and not surprising considering the current climate with a hike in interest rates that we have just seen constantly go up and go up and go up, is people that are in private rented accommodation. They have lost their tenancy for a number of reasons. The landlord can no longer pay the mortgage. The landlord has asked for an increase in the rent that people can't afford, or indeed even the landlord themselves may have actually fallen into arrears. There are some landlords that are jumping maybe on the bandwagon in terms of that they're being able to sell their properties. Others are maybe moving, and if I take the area where I come from in South Down, or where I live in South Down, people are maybe selling their properties for Airbnbs and such like to rent out. So those coastal towns, Portrush, Ballycastle, think of all those places that we have as holiday resorts. So that's one of the reasons. The other reason as well for loss of tenancy as well for people, and it's the next largest, is sharing or family breakdown. And that has been an ongoing issue, probably more so during maybe the COVID period, but however, that is just another element. And another element then, and last but not least, is the number of properties that people live in that are deemed what is considered not reasonable. In other words, it's substandard accommodation. It doesn't meet the individual person's needs. So thinking about my own personal experience, people, for example, that have a disability, let's say someone becomes a wheelchair user and they're living in a home and they can't reach the plugs to cook a meal. That property is deemed as not reasonable. If a house is in the state of disrepair, say for example in the private rented sector, and the local council come out environmental health to inspect it, they might class that house, that home, because of the repairs as a state of disrepair. It's those type of things that cause homelessness. And we all might think, and that excludes, obviously, and I'm not excluding, but everybody thinks, and we all have this image of our head of people that are on the that obviously are homeless on the streets, and that in itself has increased, and we have seen the number of deaths that have certainly occurred in Belfast in particular over the past year or so. I don't need to give you those figures. You've seen it on the news if you've read the news. So that's another kettle of fish. So as I say, comrades, official figures. That's what I'm talking about. It's impossible, as I say, to gauge the hidden homeless. And that again, it brings into stark reality the issues then that the housing executive try to deal with, and providers that try to prevent homelessness try to deal with as well. And it's also about not just the providers, but the effects of homelessness also have a knock-on effect on our health service, because we have more people go in that revolving door in and out of hospital, either due to their mental health, their addiction or alcohol misuse, or we have people that simply have various illnesses and disabilities. And that itself plays upon, puts more pressure onto the health service. In Northern Ireland, the Housing Executive introduced a concept called Housing Solutions here about 2 to 3 years ago. And that Housing Solutions is, if you now present as homeless, you're not bandied about from one person to another. You go in and it will be that one person will deal with your case. They will then, allegedly, when you either are placed in temporary accommodation or you're placed in permanent accommodation, will look to different services, so it can be like a wraparound. That works certainly at that micro level, and where staff in health and housing and the housing executive work together. Does it work at departmental level as yet? Probably no. Does that mean that the departments don't want to work together? Well, they do, but their hands are tied, and we all know why they're tied. Here we go again. For the second time round in the space of 6 years, we've had stormed out for almost 2/3 of that. I remember the last homelessness strategy, it had something together. The current homeless strategy is ending homelessness together. Well, hell, we are not together, are we, in this society? We weren't together in the last homelessness strategy, and I attended the launch of that, and 2 days later, and that was, the current homeless strategy is 2022 to 27. The last one was the previous 5 years. 2 years later, the executive collapsed again. So we can blame statutory agencies, whatever we like, but their hands are currently tied. In terms of funding, I just want to point this out. So there is no recurring funding. It's done here in Northern Ireland, whether we have Stormont or whether we don't, on an annual basis. That is no way to plan a strategy, the homeless strategy, for 5 years in advance. I'll give you again an example from personal experience. I went to my funding body, which is part of the Housing Executive. I asked for a proposal to be put forward to expand the service, and they went, Trevor, that's all very well and good. We would support that, and there wouldn't be an issue, but we don't know what our budgets are for the next quarter. They don't know their budgets from the 1st of April. We're now, what date in March? Well, and this is the way it continues and continues and continues. And if you want homeless prevention, well then you need to fund those services, the likes of floating support services, the likes of the Welcome Centre. You need to fund some of the night shelters and some of the great work that is actually done by other organisations and offshoot projects to try and prevent homelessness. And you can't do that. You cannot do that unless you have a plan in place that is funded in place. And that does not mean also, if you do have recurrent funding, that you still don't need that annual uplift. I can tell you now, the main body in terms of homelessness prevention, part of the Housing Executive, the Supporting People programme, it's actually now across, it was a UK-wide programme. It's 20 years this year this was launched. Okay, 20 years. Up until recently, the Supporting People programme, which funds supported housing staff and funds floating support staff, and floating support staff, what they do is try to support people to give them independent living skills in that widest sense of the word, so that they can maintain their tenancy and prevent homelessness. It has been 10 years, and only recently has there been an uplift in that programme, and not by a lot. What that affects, that uplift, or what that affects, or that the non-uplift has affected, is the staff at front line that we need in terms of preventing homelessness. They haven't been given a pay raise tactically in 10 years. Their organisations might have, but this is the first time in 10 years that they have been awarded an additional amount of money. And I'm not talking, and for me this isn't a staffing thing. If you're not paying the staff, we have lost across the homelessness sector bucket loads of experienced staff, certainly over the past 2 to 3 years. And the other issue is in terms of recruitment. You cannot get staff to come in and work as housing support workers, floating support workers, people that work in supported accommodation, support workers that work in supported living accommodation services. So that's an issue, and if you're not having the expertise and you're not having the quality, then you're not going to have those services to prevent homelessness. And that for me is certainly a major issue. What do we rely on? I said there about temporary accommodation. Yes, there is at the moment a bit of a review of temporary accommodation. And to give you an idea, if you can bear with me, as I say, thank you Brian for throwing me in the loop here. But in terms of temporary accommodation, it's almost, when you think of Northern Ireland, yes, we're a small country, but what we have is roughly, I'm going to say probably about, including single lets, hostels, specialist services for people that would have challenging or risky behaviours. What we have is probably roughly about 4,000 places, if even that. That is not a terrible lot when you think of those figures that I mentioned at the beginning of people that may need temporary accommodation. So here we are. Hostels, it's being looked at the moment. It's not the best place in some circumstances for people to be, just simply because of the setup of hostels. So the Housing Executive want to look at what they call single nets, single flats. There are some of those, but they need more. So therefore, you're now becoming dependent on the private rented sector. And my criticism of the private rented sector is that it isn't doing enough to help overcome homelessness and provide support and accommodation for people that become homeless. It isn't doing enough. I'm going to be honest, it's been difficult. It's difficult to engage with them. So those are many of the different issues. When it comes then to issues of people in private rented accommodation, another reason I should say as well, people can no longer afford the rents even if it isn't the landlord's fault and he has no option, or she has no option but to put that rent, increase that rent, housing benefit stroke local housing authority rates are not adequate. So it means that people, when they lose their tenancy, are coming to the housing executive and looking for that temporary accommodation. So again, I can think of my own area, South Down. I take Downpatrick. If you come now in Downpatrick and you present as homeless and you need temporary accommodation, I can tell you there is none. But this is the stark reality right across Northern Ireland. I can take this, it can happen in Coleraine or Ballycastle or in Portrush or in Derry, and maybe not so much, well, sorry, some of the smaller towns. People are actually, I know of two cases where people are presented as homeless in Downpatrick. The temporary accommodation has been offered in Derry. Think of what that means for that person. Their GP, their friends, their family, the services they use, they lose everything. And it's either a take it or leave it. And again, I have to be honest, it isn't the housing executive's fault, it's this executive. We are not being funded. It's also central government, we are not being funded to meet even temporary accommodation. So people are being shifted from Downpatrick to Derry. At the moment in Belfast, there virtually is no temporary accommodation for people to move into. So hence, it's that vicious cycle. So we talk, and I know as a party, we want public funding, and we do definitely need public funding. I can give you a bit of good news that may be on the horizon, and maybe not a piece of good news. So we know the housing associations over the past number of years have been responsible for the social housing building programme. Well, the housing executive now want to step into the breach once again. They want to start to build. But, and here's the bad news, is that it will be on the same model as the housing associations. So there will be public money, but also then there has, like the housing associations, they will then look to the private sector or to private business or whatever. They will look to have the other part of the funding through private means. So it's good and it's bad. What we really do need is for this housing, for this assembly to get up and running, for the people in the DUP, Sinn Féin and everybody else, they get off their, pardon my language here, they get off their ass, what do you call it, to get them and go and fight with central government that we need a sound building programme here in Northern Ireland. And unless we have the housing stock, which the current building programme is not going to fulfil with even some of those tiny figures that I have given you, well then we're not going to move out of that cycle. And if we do want to prevent homelessness, we need to, and where we do settle people into accommodation, albeit hopefully permanent, that have been homeless, that do have their issues, we do need to have those wraparound services. We need the likes of floating support services. We need the likes of care packages going in if people need them. We need support from the health service. We need support from the GP. We need support from the local community, and we need support from business, but the biggest partner is non-existent. I could rant on all day here. Do I get angry about it? I do, because I know of some, and I know the experiences, and I know what I'm told, and when people come to me about an issue, I know what those issues are for those individuals. It won't get any better until Storming gets up and running. Do we get the funding issue sorted out? Until we torture central government that we need a better building programme in Northern Ireland. And just to say that that housing solutions that I talked about that the housing executive have in, that they do try this wraparound, that's nothing new. This was introduced by a group of doctors, or suggested by a group of doctors in the early 1970s in California, who seen the revolving door of the hospital and suggested this housing solutions. And now they're regarded as communists and lefties. Well, if that's communism and lefties, I'm proud to be one. Thank you very much, Conf.
A few weeks ago in the City Hall, Sinn Féin rejected the vote on private landlords to cap the benefit of much rent. these housing benefit and the top-up fee needs to be kept for all. Landlords now are charging extortion rates. There's £800, £900 now for 2-bedroom houses in working class areas. It's horrible. So what needs to be done, there needs to be a cap on the top up of what landlords can charge to people.